As a Star Wars fan, I feel really blessed to have grown up in the 1980s when the original trilogy was coming out and was actually in theaters, or also on VHS. It was a very different time to be a Star Wars fan, mostly because there was very limited content. But we had an amazing breakthrough toy line in the Kenner action figure line, and while it did come to an end in 1984, 1985 with the Power of the Force line, or now known as Power of the Force 1, now that we've had Power of the Force 2, this was really how we merged into what I had called sort of the dark times of Star Wars, where we really didn't have much. Obviously, we had the Ewok adventure movies, the Caravan of Courage, and the less talked about Ewok Battle for Endor, which is not to be confused with the Battle of Endor, which is actually a cool thing. Well, I guess the Battle for Endor movie did introduce blurgs to the world, and it was the first ever crossover between Star Wars and oatmeal, but this was really the time when the sun set on the Star Wars brand. Obviously, today we live in a very different world. Not only has Disney purchased Star Wars outright, but we are now getting unlimited new content. It's not just the original three movies, we're getting Disney Plus shows and all sorts of things. Well, the first time we really got new content for Star Wars was in 1999 when Episode 1 came out. And the lead up to this was, well, it was a very magical time. And not just the few months or the year leading up to the theatrical release, but really it was that time period between 85 and 99 when we didn't know what was going to happen with Star Wars. And when Episode 1 was announced, the young, the old, every country, every nation, every nationality, every race, gender, it was like, oh my gosh, we're getting more Star Wars. And you could run out and buy magazines with Star Wars on the cover again. It was mainstream suddenly. It was no longer this thing that hid in comic book stores or, in your basement. There were action figures coming out for the new movie, new characters. And I remember the idea of, getting figures for a movie we hadn't even seen yet, the Stapp and Mace Windu. This was mind-blowing, that there was going to be more Star Wars than just the original three movies. And part of what celebrated this was a wave of Power of the Force 2 figures, which was very unique. A lot of the figures had pack-ins to increase the perceived value, also to justify his price went up. But this wave had flashback photos. But that wasn't the only thing that was special about this wave.
And Obi-Wan. And my favorite, Chewie. They're all here!
Yes, this wave was an all-star wave. We had gotten wave after wave of sort of obscure characters, from Cantina aliens to people in the background of the Rebel briefing scene. But now with this wave, we got all the major characters redone for the first time, really, since the first wave of Power of the Force 2. And they were all there. Obi-Wan, Luke, Vader, Yoda, Aunt Beru. Okay, well, Aunt Beru got thrown in there. But it was all the other major characters. And it was cool to get an Aunt Beru figure, of course, because we never had one. And for me, the culminating figure of this wave, of course, was the Anakin Skywalker figure. The final toy we would ever get of Sebastian Shaw as Anakin, until that sort of got erased from the trilogy after Hayden Christensen from Episode 2 and 3, but that's a different story for another time. Speaking of time, though, let's go back and let's go a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole, because what I'm making a video about today are that time period before Episode 1 came out, when it felt like Episode 1 represented endless possibilities. Our imagination was fueled by playing Star Wars between the films, because that was all we had. You really couldn't go experience Star Wars in any other way. So playing with them and using our imagination to create new adventures was what drove the fandom for so many kids in the 80s. And the idea that things happened before the movie was really what fueled a lot of our dreams. There were some hints about this in the films, but we were never really told exactly what happened. Now, there was a book I had, Star Wars from Concept to Screen to Collectible, by Steve Sansweet, who's now one of the premier Star Wars collectors in the world. He runs Rancho Obi-Wan, which is a museum of every Star Wars item ever made for consumers. And on the very last page of this book, there is a closing circle of R2 and 3PO walking to Jabba's palace, but the caption under it really sparked my imagination, because it talked about how their adventure was now coming to an end, but wait a minute, could there be another adventure just along the horizon? This was kind of a bit of a, vague promise, but the idea that there could be more Star Wars, the breadcrumbs that existed in the existing content in the original three movies was just mind blowing for so many of us who grew up during this time period. As an example, during the scene where Luke Skywalker meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, actually after they meet and go back to his home.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
So what in the world were the Clone Wars? I mean, it was a throwaway line, and the idea that there were these Jedi Knights somehow involved with clones, I mean, what exactly was a Jedi Knight? What did they look like? What did they do? I kind of thought a lot of it was taken from the Ralph McQuarrie concept drawings, which did seem to float around during the 80s when we saw warriors holding lightsabers, which I assumed that this is what a Jedi Knight looked like. They were wearing kind of armor and they had capes and, cool like headpieces and goggles and air tanks. So growing up, this is kind of what I assumed a Jedi Knight looked like. Well, other takes on the Clone Wars did sort of come to fruition before Episode 1. There was, of course, Heir to the Empire, Zahn's first Star Wars book, where clones got lots of vowels in their name, and then there was Kenner's take on what could have been a continuation of Power of the Force 1, where a character named Atha Prime becomes the new main villain and brings with him a whole bunch of clones left over from the Clone Wars. So, the idea of clones existing in Star Wars popped up a lot, but obviously once the prequels came out, we learned that the clones were just the precursors of stormtroopers and were set up to be the vehicle for the Jedi's destruction based on Palpatine manipulating things. But there were other hints, too, laid out throughout the classic trilogy. I mean, Obi-Wan has that great talk with Luke on Dagobah.
I'm familiar about this place.
And that line of Luke's saying that he remembered Dagobah, growing up, to me, that was like a huge hint at what was going to happen in the prequels. To me, I thought, well, that means that Luke probably got trained by Yoda on Dagobah as a kid and then got sent back to Tatooine. I don't know if I'm the only one who thought this, but that line really sparked my imagination as a kid. I mean, it turned out the only other people he met on Dagobah were Miss Piggy and Kermit, but, can't have it all. Another breadcrumb in the original trilogy was the line about Luke and Leia's mom on Endor.
Leia, do you remember your mother? Your real mother?
Just a little bit. She died when I was very young.
Now, of course, it turned out that Padme never actually met her children, or at least only saw them as infants. We knew that Leia was raised on Alderaan, that, hence she was an Alderaan princess. And, the idea that she was Bale Organa's daughter was something that was discussed in things like the radio drama and other sort of expanded universe concepts going back all the way to the early 80s. So, yeah, the idea that Leia was raised on Alderaan, but that line about her remembering her mother, her real mother, I was fascinated by that. And it was like, wow, so she actually knew her mom, but her mom died when she was young and was very sad. I kind of thought it might have had some biblical allusions. If you know your Bible, your book of Exodus, when Moses is sent down the Nile River and picked up by Pharaoh's daughter, his sister Miriam, and later his actual birth mother, Jochebed, actually helped raise him. So I thought that might have been part how she remembered her mother. Maybe her mother was a handmaiden to the Queen of Alderaan who helped raise Leia and maybe revealed to her that she really was her mother. Who knows? But that never really happened. Now, while there were disappointing things about the prequels, there were some cool things that blew my mind as well. One of them being this guy, the original Bale Organa, who then got renamed Bale Antilles because Lucas realized he wanted a different actor to play Bale Organa since he was going to play a big role in Episode 2 and 3. But they did film some scenes with the original actor playing Bale Organa, who then got changed to Bale Antilles, who's mentioned in one line about the guy running against Palpatine for president of the Senate. And you'll notice that aide on the left there of him. Well, looking at the Alderaanian aide and her dress and her hairdo, this is the thing I loved about the prequels, that they did this kind of stuff. it sort of showed that Princess Leia and her hairdo, she was dressed as an Alderanian. Alderanian. The same thing with the Jedi. When we met the Jedi for the first time and saw how they dressed, that they wore these robes and belts and cloaks, etc., and that this was their warrior outfit, it gave an entirely new interpretation of the original trilogy, specifically Obi-Wan Kenobi in Episode 4. He wasn't just an old hermit. I always assumed these were hermit clothes he was wearing. Looked a lot like Uncle Owen, actually. No, he was actually dressed as a Jedi Knight. So, while there were things that disappointed me with the prequels that never came to be, some of those breadcrumbs that were spread throughout the original trilogy, there were also some neat surprises. And yes, obviously there were some things that were just very disappointing about the new movies, but the less said about that, the better. Either way, sometimes it really is that our imaginations and the stories we create are often better than the actual reveal. Some secrets are best kept hidden. I wonder what it would have been like if episode 1 and 2, 3 were never made and we only had the original movies. It's an interesting what if to think about. What are your thoughts? Are there things that you were really looking forward to in the prequels that never came to pass based on your experience watching the original trilogy? Let me know in the comments below. Leave a message and I'll comment back. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.